Close your eyes and imagine the sky over occupied Germany in the final weeks of World War II, where the Third Reich is collapsing, but still possessing technological marvels that will shape the future of aviation. Where captured airfields hold aircraft so advanced they seem to belong to a different era. Where jet fighters and rocket planes and experimental designs that pushed the boundaries of aerodynamic possibility sit abandoned or partially destroyed as their designers and test pilots flee the advancing Allied armies. Your name is Eric Winkle Brown. You are 26 years old, a Royal Navy pilot with the Fleet Air Arm, and you are about to become the only Allied pilot to fly virtually every aircraft Nazi Germany produced, to test the jets and rockets and experimental designs that represent the cutting edge of aeronautical engineering, to evaluate the weapons that might have changed the war's outcome if they had been developed earlier, or produced in sufficient numbers, or deployed with strategic coherence rather than as desperate measures improvised while the Reich crumbled. You are 5 feet 7 inches tall, hence the nickname Winkle. Speak fluent German learned during childhood summers in Germany before the war, when your father took you to air shows and you met Ernst Udet and other Luftwaffe pioneers. Possess the rare combination of technical expertise and linguistic ability and sheer pilot skill that makes you perfect candidate for the mission that is about to define your career. May 1945. Germany has surrendered, but the occupation forces are still cataloging what they have captured, still discovering the extent of German technological development in the final years of the war, still finding aircraft and research facilities and wind tunnels and engineering documents that reveal how close the Luftwaffe came to fielding fighters that could have contested Allied air superiority, despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. You climb into the cockpit, study the instruments and controls that are labeled in German but which you can read fluently. Familiarize yourself with the systems that differ from conventional fighters, the throttle response that requires patience because abrupt inputs cause engine flameouts, the landing gear that must be extended early because hydraulic pressure builds slowly, the gun sight that is optimized for deflection shooting against bomber formations rather than turning dogfights that characterized earlier aerial combat. The pre-flight checks are extensive, the procedures more complex than piston engine fighters, the margins for error narrower because jet engines are less forgiving of pilot mistakes or mechanical irregularities. The German chief mechanic watches you prepare for flight with expression you cannot quite read. Curiosity, perhaps, or professional interest in seeing whether British pilot can successfully operate the technology that Germany developed but could not deploy effectively. Or simply the resignation of a defeated engineer watching his creations being evaluated by enemies who now control them. Be careful with the throttles, he advises in German that he assumes you might not understand. The engines flame out if you reduce power too quickly, and do not attempt aerobatics. The airframe has stress limits that are exceeded easily if you are not careful. You acknowledge the advice in German, startling the mechanic with your fluency, with the accent that reveals you learned the language before the war rather than through military training. "I will treat your aircraft with respect," you tell him, recognizing that despite the circumstances, despite being enemies until days ago, despite the war and the occupation and all the reasons for hatred, there is professional courtesy between engineers and pilots that transcends national allegiance, that acknowledges the shared passion for aviation and the mutual recognition that these machines represent human achievement regardless of the purposes they were designed to serve. The engine start sequence is unfamiliar, requires external power source to spin the turbines to starting speed before fuel is introduced, requires careful monitoring of exhaust gas temperature and turbine RPM to ensure the engines light off smoothly rather than experiencing hot starts that can damage the turbine blades. The sound is unlike anything you have heard from aircraft engines, not the reciprocating roar of pistons, but a continuous, high-pitched whine that builds in intensity as the turbines accelerate, that creates vibration you can feel through the airframe, that announces this is fundamentally different technology operating on principles that have nothing to do with conventional aviation. You taxi slowly, getting feel for the controls, for the way the aircraft responds to rudder and brake inputs, for the sight picture over the nose that is different from the fighters you are accustomed to flying. The Messerschmitt 262 feels heavy on the ground, sluggish in a way that contradicts its reputation for speed, and you understand that the performance advantage exists only at high speed, only when the aircraft is flying fast enough for the aerodynamics to work as designed, only when the engines are producing thrust that overcomes the weight and drag that make the jet inferior to conventional fighters in slow-speed maneuvering. You line up on the runway, advance the throttles carefully, monitoring the engine instruments to ensure both UMO turbojets are accelerating together, that neither is lagging or over-temping or showing signs of the flameouts that plagued Messerschmitt 262 operations. The acceleration is gradual, not the immediate surge you expect from the revolutionary technology, and you must resist the impulse to advance the throttles more aggressively, because doing so will cause the engines to quit and leave you stranded on the runway with aircraft too heavy to stop in the remaining distance. The nose gear lifts at perhaps 120 miles per hour, much faster than conventional fighters, and the main gear breaks contact with the runway at 175 miles per hour, speed that seems excessive until you are airborne and climbing, and the aircraft begins to reveal its true nature. The transformation is immediate and startling. The ME-262 that felt sluggish and heavy during taxi and takeoff becomes something entirely different once airborne and accelerating through 300 miles per hour, becomes the aircraft that Luftwaffe pilots described with the reverence reserved for weapons that fundamentally change tactical possibilities, that make obsolete the combat techniques developed over 5 years of war. You climb at angle that would be impossible in conventional fighters. Feel the speed building in ways that defy your experience with piston-engine aircraft. Watch the airspeed indicator sweep past 400, past 450, past 500 miles per hour, where the controls become heavier and the aircraft more stable, where you are flying faster than anything except dive bombers in terminal descent, where you understand viscerally why Allied fighter pilots feared encountering these jets, why the tactical advice was to avoid engagement if possible, because the speed differential made interception nearly impossible. You level off at 25,000 feet, throttle back to cruise power, and fly a series of basic maneuvers designed to assess handling characteristics and performance envelope. The controls are responsive at speed, but require significant force, no power assistance or trim and tabs to reduce pilot workload, demanding physical strength that makes extended combat fatiguing in ways that modern fighters with hydraulic controls would eliminate. The turn rate is mediocre. The ME-262 cannot match the sustained turning performance of Spitfires or Mustangs, or even the Bf-109s you know the aircraft was meant to replace, cannot engage in the kind of dogfighting that characterized aerial combat throughout the war. But the jet is not designed for dogfighting. You recognize this as you explore the performance envelope, as you understand the tactical doctrine that German pilots developed for aircraft that could not turn with conventional fighters, but which could attack and disengage at will through sheer speed advantage. The ME-262 attacks in high-speed passes, uses its velocity to close on bomber formations faster than escorts can react, fires its devastating 30mm cannons in brief bursts that destroy targets with shocking efficiency, and then extends away using speed that makes pursuit futile, climbing back to altitude for another attack while Allied fighters are still turning to intercept, still trying to position for shots against target that is already beyond their effective range. You attempt a high-speed dive, pushing the nose down and allowing speed to build past 550 miles per hour, where the aircraft begins to buffet slightly, where you feel the onset of compressibility effects that were poorly understood in 1945, where the transonic airflow creates shock waves on the wings and control surfaces that change the aircraft's handling in ways that can be dangerous if the pilot does not recognize what is happening. You pull back on the stick to recover from the dive, and the aircraft responds sluggishly at first, the controls feeling mushy because the shock waves are disrupting airflow over the elevators, requiring more force and more patience than conventional recovery techniques demand. This is how several ME-262s were lost during operational service, you realize. Pilots pushing into speed ranges where the aircraft behaves unpredictably, where the familiar techniques stop working, where recovery from high-speed dives becomes problematic because the technology has outpaced the understanding of aerodynamics required to operate it safely. The Luftwaffe lost jets to compressibility effects more often than to Allied fighters in some periods, lost experienced pilots who simply disappeared during routine flights, who probably encountered the edge of transonic flight and did not recognize what was happening until the aircraft became uncontrollable. You practice approaches and landings, discovering that the ME-262 requires techniques entirely different from conventional aircraft. The engines take time to spool up when power is added, requiring you to anticipate power requirements rather than reacting to immediate needs, requiring you to plan the approach more carefully because late corrections are difficult when the throttle response is delayed. The landing speed is high, over 120 miles per hour, faster than many fighters' cruise speeds, requiring long runways and precise energy management because the aircraft does not slow down quickly,
and running off the end of the runway is genuine risk if the approach is too fast or too high. You complete 3 landings, each one improving as you adapt to the jet's characteristics, as you learn to anticipate its behavior rather than reacting to it, as you develop a different mental model required for aircraft that operates according to principles unfamiliar to pilots trained on conventional fighters. The final landing is smooth, professional, the kind of arrival that demonstrates competence rather than merely survival, and you taxi back to the parking area where the German mechanics are waiting with expressions that suggest they are reassessing their assumptions about British pilots, about whether enemies who defeated Germany might actually possess the skill and adaptability to master the technology that was supposed to provide decisive advantage. "How was it?" the chief mechanic asks in German, his professional curiosity apparently overcoming any reluctance to engage with a British officer who has just flown his aircraft. You consider how to answer, how to balance honest assessment with the awareness that anything you say will be reported, will become part of the intelligence gathered about German technology and its evaluation by Allied pilots. "Revolutionary," you say finally, choosing a word that captures both the achievement and the limitations, both the genuine breakthrough in propulsion technology and the operational challenges that prevented the Me-262 from changing the war's outcome. The speed is extraordinary. The engines are unreliable. The aircraft requires different tactics than conventional fighters. If Germany had deployed these in 1943 instead of 1945, if you had solved the engine reliability problems, if the production numbers had been higher, the results might have been very different.
The mechanic nods, appreciating the professional assessment, appreciating, perhaps, that you recognize the achievement even while acknowledging the failure to implement it effectively. "We knew," he says quietly, his voice carrying the resignation of engineer who understood the potential but watched it squandered through strategic incompetence and resource shortages and Hitler's interference in aircraft development. "We knew the jets could change everything, but by the time they were ready, it was too late. The Allies had too many aircraft, too much production capacity, too many pilots. Even revolutionary technology could not overcome the numbers." Over the following weeks, you fly more German jets. The Winkle HE-162, Volksjäger, the People's Fighter, a desperate attempt to create a simple, cheap jet that could be mass-produced and flown by Hitler Youth with minimal training, a concept so fundamentally flawed that the aircraft killed more German pilots during training than it destroyed Allied aircraft in combat. The aircraft is unstable, twitchy, dangerous in ways that make the Me-262 seem forgiving by comparison, prone to catastrophic failures where the wooden wings separate from the fuselage during maneuvers, where the single engine flames out unpredictably, where emergency procedures are theoretical because the aircraft's behavior in extremis is unpredictable and usually fatal. You fly it anyway because understanding German technology requires experiencing it firsthand, requires pushing the aircraft to its limits and documenting the results, requires accepting risks that peacetime test flying would never justify, but which the intelligence value of the mission makes acceptable to commanders who need a comprehensive assessment of enemy capabilities. The He-162 is terrifying in ways the Messerschmitt 262 never was. Feels fundamentally wrong from the moment you climb into the cramped cockpit with its crude instrumentation and minimal pilot protection, with the single BMW 003 turbojet mounted above the fuselage in configuration that creates dangerous aerodynamic interactions between the engine exhaust and the airframe, with the control responses that are so sensitive that experienced pilots describe the aircraft as trying to kill them, as actively seeking opportunities to depart controlled flight and enter spins or tumbles from which recovery is uncertain at best. You complete 2 flights in the He-162, documenting its vicious handling and the design compromises that made it nearly unflyable, understanding why the program was abandoned even by desperate Luftwaffe that was willing to accept almost any solution to the overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. "This is not an aircraft," you write in your evaluation report, words chosen carefully to convey professional assessment rather than emotional reaction. "This is a death trap disguised as fighter, designed by engineers who prioritized production simplicity over pilot survival, who created weapon that kills its own pilots more reliably than it kills enemies. The concept of minimally trained pilots flying this aircraft is criminally negligent. Even experienced jet pilots find the He-162 nearly uncontrollable. Deploying it operationally would constitute murder of German youth for no tactical gain. But the aircraft you truly want to fly, the one that represents the absolute pinnacle of German aeronautical achievement and madness combined, is the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, the rocket-powered interceptor that climbs to 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes, that flies at speeds approaching 600 miles per hour, that carries enough fuel for only 8 minutes of powered flight, that lands as glider after the rocket motor burns out, that kills pilots through accidents and fuel explosions and the simple violence of flying at speeds and altitudes where human physiology is tested beyond its limits. You find a comet at Bad Schweizenan airfield, one of the few remaining examples that has not been destroyed or damaged beyond repair, sitting on its wheeled dolly because the aircraft jettisons its takeoff gear after becoming airborne and lands on a retractable skid, a design choice that saves weight but makes ground handling awkward and creates significant risk during landing when the pilot must judge the approach perfectly because there is no opportunity for go-around once committed, no second chances when flying an aircraft that becomes an unpowered glider once the rocket fuel is exhausted. The German test pilot who flew the Comet operationally, one of the few survivors of a program that had appalling casualty rates, briefs you on the aircraft with the intensity of someone who has confronted death repeatedly and wants to ensure you understand what you are attempting. The fuel is hypergolic, meaning the 2 components, T stuff and C stuff, hydrogen peroxide and methanol hydrazine, ignite spontaneously when they contact each other, creating thrust without need for ignition system, but also creating catastrophic explosions if the fuel tanks rupture during hard landings, or if the fuel lines leak and the 2 components mix outside the combustion chamber. "Pilots have dissolved," the German continues, his voice flat, stating fact without embellishment. "The C stuff is corrosive. If fuel leaks during landing, if the tanks rupture, if you are still in the cockpit when the chemicals mix, you dissolve. We have found pilots reduced to liquid in their cockpits. This is not exaggeration. This is documented reality of flying the Comet." The briefing continues with a litany of other hazards, the acceleration during powered flight that can cause blackout if the pilot is not prepared, the deceleration when the rocket shuts down that creates the opposite problem, the limited endurance that requires perfect timing to reach interception altitude, attack, and return to base before the fuel is exhausted,
the landing on the skid that must be executed precisely because the aircraft has no ability to absorb landing errors, no margin for approach mistakes, no forgiveness for pilots who misjudge the glide or the flare or the touchdown. "I still want to fly it," you tell the German test pilot, understanding that he is not trying to discourage you, but rather ensuring you comprehend the risks, ensuring that your decision to fly the Comet is informed rather than reckless, ensuring that if you die in the attempt, the responsibility is yours rather than his for failing to adequately warn you. The pre-flight preparation is extensive, involves donning a protective suit that is supposed to offer some protection against the corrosive fuel, though you understand this is mostly psychological comfort, because if the fuel system fails catastrophically, the suit will not save you, merely ensure your remains can be identified rather than dissolved beyond recognition. You are strapped into the cockpit by ground crew who handle you carefully, who understand that once you are secured in the aircraft, your ability to exit quickly is limited, that emergency exit from the Comet is difficult in the best circumstances and nearly impossible if the aircraft is damaged or inverted or on fire.
The rocket ignition sequence is unlike anything you have experienced. Not the gradual buildup of piston engines or even the spooling of jet turbines, but the instantaneous violence of hypergolic fuel ignition, the sudden acceleration that slams you back into the seat with force that grazes your vision, that compresses your chest and makes breathing difficult, that transforms the aircraft from stationary object to projectile in seconds that feel both infinitely long and impossibly compressed. The acceleration is brutal, sustained, unnatural in its intensity, and you fight to maintain consciousness while the altimeter unwinds rapidly, while the airspeed builds toward speeds that seem impossible for aircraft with wings and control surfaces designed in 1940s, while you climb toward interception altitude at rate that makes conventional fighters seem stationary by comparison. 3 minutes after ignition, you are at 30,000 feet, the rocket still burning, the fuel gauges showing rapid consumption that will exhaust the supply in perhaps 5 more minutes of powered flight. You level off, reduce throttle to conserve remaining fuel, and the deceleration is almost as violent as the acceleration was, creates the sensation of being thrown forward against the straps, creates disorientation that you must fight through while maintaining aircraft control and situational awareness and the constant monitoring of fuel state that determines when you must begin the glide back to base. The handling at altitude is extraordinary. The Comet is light and responsive, turns with a rate that no conventional fighter can match, demonstrates the performance that made it theoretically capable of intercepting high-altitude bombers that were previously nearly invulnerable to fighter attack. But the powered endurance is so limited that tactical window for attack is measured in seconds, requires perfect positioning and timing, requires pilot to climb to altitude, acquire target, attack, and begin descent, all within the brief period when rocket thrust is available, all while managing fuel consumption and planning for the unpowered glide that will determine whether you reach the airfield or are forced to land in whatever terrain presents itself when the fuel runs out. You shut down the rocket motor, trading powered flight for the silence of gliding, for the dramatic transition from acceleration to deceleration, from climbing to descending, from powered interceptor to vulnerable glider that must reach base before altitude is exhausted. The glide ratio is acceptable. The Comet's clean aerodynamics allow it to cover significant distance without power, but the descent is inexorable, the altitude bleeding away steadily,
the calculations about whether you can reach the runway becoming increasingly urgent as you approach the airfield and assess the approach angle and the energy state.
18.7. The approach to landing is exercise in precision that tolerates no error, requires judging the glide path perfectly, because you have no engine to add power if you are low, no ability to go around if you misjudge the approach, no second chances when flying an aircraft that becomes committed to landing the moment you begin the final descent. You configure the aircraft for landing, extending the skid that will absorb the impact, deploying the small speed brakes that help control the descent rate, trimming for the approach speed that represents compromise between maintaining sufficient control authority and not carrying excessive energy that will make the touchdown violent. The runway appears below, the threshold passing beneath as you judge the height and the rate of descent, and the point where you will flare to arrest the sink and transition from gliding flight to ground contact. You pull back gently on the stick, raising the nose, bleeding off speed, while maintaining just enough to keep the controls effective, feeling for the moment when the skid will contact the runway and the aircraft will transition from flying machine to sliding object, subject to friction and momentum rather than aerodynamic forces. The skid touches with jarring impact that sends shudder through the airframe, creates the screeching sound of metal on concrete, begins the deceleration that will determine whether you stop on the runway or slide off the end into the grass beyond. The aircraft slows, the runway ahead still adequate, and you apply the speed brake more aggressively to ensure you stop with margin remaining. And finally, the Comet comes to rest perhaps 3/4 down the runway length. The skid having survived the landing without damage, the fuel tanks having remained intact without rupturing and mixing their deadly contents, your body having endured the rocket acceleration and the landing impact without injury. You sit in the cockpit for a moment, breathing heavily, processing what you just experienced, understanding why the Comet program had such appalling casualty rates, why even experienced test pilots died in numbers that made the aircraft strategically counterproductive regardless of its theoretical performance advantages. The technology pushed beyond what was safe or sustainable, created weapon that was as dangerous to its operators as to intended targets, represented the desperation of regime that was willing to sacrifice pilots to gain marginal tactical advantage that could not change the war's fundamental trajectory. The German test pilot you briefed approaches as ground crew help you from the cockpit, his expression suggesting he is simultaneously impressed that you survived and vindicated in his warnings about the aircraft's dangers. "You flew it well," he says, the compliment measured, professional. Many pilots do not survive their first flight in the Comet. The rocket acceleration overwhelms them, or they misjudge the landing, or the fuel system fails. You were fortunate, and you were skilled. Both are necessary. Over the following months, you fly nearly every aircraft the Luftwaffe developed or deployed during the war. Conventional fighters like the FW-19 and the Bf-109 variants, captured examples of bombers and reconnaissance aircraft, experimental designs that never reached production, but which revealed the directions German engineers were exploring, the innovations they were developing that might have changed aerial warfare if the war had continued longer, or if resources had been available to implement them properly.
You fly the Arado R-234 Blitz, the world's first operational jet bomber, experiencing the aircraft that conducted reconnaissance missions over Britain in the war's final months, and which Allied fighters could not intercept because of its speed advantage, understanding the potential of jet bombers to render conventional air defenses obsolete if the technology could be made reliable and produced in sufficient numbers. You fly the Dornier Do 335 File, the fastest piston-engine fighter the Luftwaffe developed, with its unusual push-pull configuration that placed engines in both the nose and tail, creating aircraft that was complex and difficult to maintain, but which achieved speeds approaching those of early jets through clever engineering rather than revolutionary technology. You fly the Bachem BA-349 Natter, the vertical takeoff rocket interceptor that was even more desperate and dangerous than the Comet, designed to be launched from rail and to attack bomber formations in a single pass before the pilot bailed out and the aircraft was destroyed. A concept so extreme that only one manned test flight was attempted, and the pilot was killed when the canopy separated prematurely during launch, and he was unable to bail out.
Each flight adds to your understanding of German aeronautical development, of the innovations and the dead ends, of the brilliant engineering solutions and the catastrophic design failures, of the technology that worked and the technology that killed pilots faster than enemies could. You document everything meticulously, the performance characteristics, the handling qualities, the systems and controls, the strengths and weaknesses that Allied intelligence needs to understand, both to exploit any German technology worth incorporating into British designs and to develop countermeasures against the innovations that might appear in future conflicts if other nations adopt the technologies Germany pioneered. The work is dangerous, demands skills that few pilots possess, the technical knowledge to understand complex systems, the linguistic ability to read German technical manuals and communicate with German engineers, the piloting skill to fly unfamiliar aircraft safely despite their quirks and hazards, the courage to test aircraft that have killed their designers' own test pilots, the judgment to know when pushing further risks valuable life for diminishing intelligence returns. You survive when other test pilots do not, when crashes and mechanical failures and the simple unpredictability of flying captured enemy aircraft claim lives of colleagues who were perhaps equally skilled but less fortunate, who encountered the specific combination of circumstances that turned routine evaluation into fatal accident. The survival is partly skill. You are exceptionally talented pilot with instincts and judgment developed through thousands of hours of flight time, but also partly luck, the random distribution of mechanical failures and weather conditions, and the thousand small factors that determine whether test flight ends with successful landing or with wreckage and casualties. The intelligence you gather shapes post-war British aircraft development, influences the designs that emerge in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when the lessons learned from German technology are incorporated into Allied jet fighters and bombers, when the swept wings and jet propulsion and pressurized cockpits and other innovations that Germany pioneered become standard features on Western aircraft. The Me-262's swept wing design influences British and American jet development. The Arado's reconnaissance capabilities inform strategic thinking about jet bomber employment.
Even the comet's rocket propulsion contributes to understanding of high-speed flight and the challenges of transonic and supersonic aerodynamics. But the most important lesson you extract from flying the Luftwaffe's secret jets is not technical, it is strategic and human. The lesson is that technological superiority alone cannot win wars, that Germany developed aircraft that were in some ways a generation ahead of Allied designs, but could not deploy them effectively because of resource shortages and strategic incompetence and Hitler's interference in development priorities, because innovation without the industrial capacity to produce it and the strategic wisdom to employ it becomes merely interesting failure rather than decisive advantage.
You continued test flying after the war ends, transition from evaluating captured German aircraft to testing British jets at experimental designs, accumulate flight time in over 480 different aircraft types during your career, set records that will likely never be broken because modern aviation is too specialized, too regulated, too expensive to allow a single pilot to fly the incredible variety of aircraft that you experienced during the unique historical moment when technology was evolving rapidly and captured enemy aircraft were available for evaluation and test pilots could take risks that would be considered unacceptable in contemporary aviation. You make 2,407 carrier landings, more than any pilot in history, surviving the most dangerous phase of naval aviation repeatedly, mastering the technique of bringing aircraft onto a moving deck in all weather conditions, in aircraft ranging from propeller trainers to high-performance jets, demonstrating the consistency and skill that separates exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. You survive crashes and ejections and mechanical failures that should have killed you, accumulating the near misses and close calls that characterize long careers in test flying, emerging each time to return to the cockpit because flying is not just what you do, but who you are, because the work matters in ways that transcend personal risk. The German engineers you worked with during the evaluation period, the mechanics and test pilots who briefed you on their aircraft and watched you fly designs they created, many of them emigrate after the war or are recruited by Allied governments who recognize that technical expertise has value regardless of the nationality that developed it. That German aeronautical knowledge represents strategic asset worth acquiring, even if it means employing former enemies. Some go to America through Operation Paperclip, some to Britain, some to Soviet Union, all of them carrying the knowledge and experience that will shape Cold War aviation development, that will contribute to the jet fighters and bombers and missiles that define the arms race between East and West. You maintain contact with some of them over the decades, correspond about technical matters, and reminisce about the aircraft you flew together. Develop the professional relationships that transcend the war and the ideologies that divided you, that acknowledge the shared passion for aviation and the mutual respect between pilots and engineers who pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The relationships are not friendships exactly, too much history, too much complexity, too much awareness of what the regime they served did and what you were fighting to prevent, but they are connections built on genuine mutual respect, on acknowledgement that aeronautical achievement belongs to humanity rather than to individual nations, that the technology developed during the war can be evaluated separately from the purposes it was meant to serve. You write extensively about your experiences, publish books and articles that document the German aircraft you flew and the lessons learned from evaluating enemy technology, that preserve the technical details and the human stories that would otherwise be lost as the pilots and engineers who experienced them die and the aircraft themselves are scrapped or relegated to museums. The writing is precise, technical, unsentimental. You are describing machines and their performance characteristics, not romanticizing the war or glorifying the technology. But it is also essential historical record that ensures future generations understand what was achieved and what was learned and what mistakes were made.
You die in 2016 at age 97, having survived into an era where fighter pilots fly aircraft with capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction to the German engineers you worked with in 1945, where jet propulsion and swept wings and rocket technology have evolved into stealth fighters and supersonic bombers and spacecraft that push beyond atmosphere entirely. Your obituaries note the records: most aircraft carrier landings, most aircraft types flown, most diverse flying career in aviation history. But they also emphasize the unique historical role you played in evaluating German technology, in preserving the lessons learned from flying the Luftwaffe's secret jets, in ensuring that the innovations developed during the war informed post-war aviation development rather than disappearing into classified files, or being lost when the last engineers who understood them died. The aircraft you flew exist now mostly in museums. The ME-262s and HE-162s and Comets preserved behind barriers where visitors can see them but cannot touch them, cannot experience them as living machines the way you did when you climbed into their cockpits and tested them at their limits and documented their capabilities and vulnerabilities. The preservation is necessary. The aircraft represent irreplaceable artifacts of aviation history, evidence of what was achieved during the war and what was learned from evaluating enemy technology. But it also creates distance between the machines and their reality, transforms them from dangerous experimental aircraft into static displays that cannot convey the terror of landing a comet on a skid, or the exhilaration of flying an ME-262 at speeds no Allied fighter could match. Your flight logs and reports remain in archives, available to researchers who need technical details about German aircraft performance, or who are studying the history of jet aviation development, or simply want to understand what it was like to fly these machines, what Eric Winkle Brown experienced during those months in 1945 and 1946, when he became the only Allied pilot to comprehensively evaluate the Luftwaffe's technological achievements, when he risked his life repeatedly to gather intelligence that shaped post-war aviation and preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost.